If dysfunction feels familiar, it doesn't mean that you're broken. It means that you learned how to adapt. And here's the thing that no one tells you. Dysfunction doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it just feels normal. This episode is going to be a little different than my usual relationship rants this season. And what you're about to hear was recorded during a live girls' night in, but I wanted to share it here because this story sits right at the heart of so many relationship patterns without sounding like it does. This isn't about work or personality tests or self-improvement. It's about identity. It's about who we learn to be in order to belong, to be safe, to be accepted. And just how quietly that identity can start running our relationships, our work, and our lives. We praise people for being adaptable, flexible, resilient, but we don't stop and ask what it's costing them. And then, of course, we're surprised when they're exhausted, resentful, or disconnected in their relationships. Now, I don't believe that people are broken, even when it sometimes feels like we are. I do think that a lot of what we call struggle is actually misunderstanding. It's old stories operating so automatically that they feel like our personality. And the shift that changes things isn't usually loud or dramatic. It's often a pause, a noticing, a moment where something we thought was just who I am becomes a little less solid. So the story that you're about to hear is one of those moments for me. You don't need to relate to the specifics of my life for this to land. But if you've ever felt like you had to contort yourself or shape yourself to fit in somewhere, if you've ever felt like you've had to soften something essential within or had to work harder than felt natural just to belong, this will make sense. Welcome to Create Your Happy. I'm Christy Holt, your one and only happiness hussy. And this season, I'm going there. These relationship rants are for the woman ready to stop abandoning herself and start choosing truth. Let's get into it. This is how dysfunction usually works. Not through chaos or crisis, but through quiet repetition. Through small adjustments that slowly become invisible, normal even, until one day you realize that you've been working harder than you ever meant to. If anything in this episode feels familiar, it doesn't mean that you missed a red flag. It means that you learned how to belong in the best way you knew how to at the time. And this story lives in that space.
In a past life, I used to be a professional accountant. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. What? This woman with the boa and the tiara and the happiness hussy and all of this sweary language used to be an accountant? Like with taxes and auditing and all that stuff? That doesn't make much sense. And that's exactly where I'm going to be going with this first story. So early on in my accounting career, I remember this one day. I was on a training and we did this personality assessment thing. I looked it up later because I couldn't remember, but it was a DISC assessment. Does anybody know what a DISC assessment is? It's colors, okay? I don't remember much more about it than that, but it kind of puts you in 4 categories, okay? I will just say, everyone else came out blue, okay? Analytical, logical, structured, detail-oriented, and here I am, the lone yellow. Now, yellow is about being relational, about big picture rather than the details. People-focused, right? Outgoing, friendly, probably a little sassy. And immediately, if you were like, oh, I already know what color I would be, and I know that I'm not the one that the system was built for, girl, same, because this was very much one of these things is not like the other sort of situation, okay? So I felt it immediately, this sort of internal knowing, right, that I do not fit. Hey, I am probably going to have to mute something here in order to belong. And you guys, at this point, I have invested years of my life in becoming a professional accountant. 4 years of university. I was already underway in my professional designation program to become a chartered accountant. All of this time, all of this money. And I was on a good, stable path with a good job, right? And so I stayed and I did the work and I fucking did it well, okay? I am a good employee, much to my own detriment. The parts of the job that I really, really loved, this is where the irony starts to come in, is because I loved mentoring other students, new employees. I loved supporting people. I eventually ended up in a management role and I loved leading people, leading trainings. But these things, they were not billable, right? And my performance reviews reflected that fact. And at the time, I didn't recognize it as misalignment. I saw it as me needing to adapt myself, right? Because standing out felt terribly uncomfortable. So I contorted. I softened what made me stand out, what made me different, what I did what I had to do to try and fit. And of course, that kind of worked for a while. Yeah, I'm actually pretty good at pretending shit's okay, even though it's absolutely blowing apart on the, underneath the surface. So it worked kind of on the outside. But over time, all of this contorting and shrinking myself to fit somewhere that I obviously, in retrospect, wasn't meant to be, burned me the fuck out. And in time, I started to genuinely believe that this burnt out, stressed out, overwhelmed, not really a fit for this, job version of me was just who I am. And I didn't realize it then, but I was already telling myself a story about who I was and who I was allowed to be. That story actually shaped everything that came next in my life. So quick vibe check before we move on. I'm just wondering if you've ever recognized yourself in that feeling of being the odd one out, adapting to fit somewhere that didn't quite fit. And I'll invite you just to nod or drop a react or drop a quick yep in the chat if this is you. Oh, yeah, I kind of figured, blowing up with the yes, and that's how my job makes me feel and relatable. I kind of had a feeling because I know I'm not alone in these things. And like I said, you don't have to have been in a corporate job to feel these things. It can be within your friend group, right? It can be within your relationships. It can be within your family, right? These patterns show up across all kinds of areas.
Okay, and here I want to acknowledge that I did split the recording. You might notice a little skip ahead in what I'm talking about because the following section comes a little bit later in that same live talk after I shared a story that I have already previously shared in episode 3 of this season. So not wanting to repeat that, but wanting to land on this final important note, I do invite you to go back and listen to episode 3 of this season if you didn't hear the story about my ex telling me that he wanted and enjoyed giving me a rope to hang myself with. But back to the live Girls Night In chat.
What I came to sort of realize through this is that my stories have dramatically changed since they initially happened. And those changed stories have created a massive shift for me. And here's where another layer sort of revealed itself as I continued to shift. Because for a long time, I was telling myself stories like there was something wrong with me, right? Because I wasn't like the other accountants, or I was the victim in my relationship, that he needed to change, but that he probably would never change, and that nothing was fair. There was nothing I could do. And also kind of that everything sucked, but I didn't know how to change anything without blowing up my life. If only circumstances were different. You get the picture, right? And so what's so important to recognize is that the stories I was telling myself shaped my experience. And the stories that you're telling yourself shape your experience too, right? It affected how I felt, how I showed up, and what I believed was even possible in my life. And things did not start to change, they literally didn't, until I started to tell myself a new story. One that said, I was never just meant to be like the others, and I could choose myself, right? I may have been the victim of some mistreatment, but I would become the victor, victorious, over my circumstances and my suffering. And if circumstances weren't going to change, well, I damn well would. The shift, it didn't erase the past, right? It did change my belief, though. Changed my ongoing future stories, and it changed me. It changed my identity. And that changed basically everything.
And that wraps up the live segment of the story that I'm sharing. And coming back to this now outside of that live conversation, what stayed with me about this story and about that moment that I was sharing about here wasn't the personality test. It was how fucking quickly I assumed that the problem was me. How quickly I shifted the story from I'm different to there's something wrong with me. And at the time, I didn't see it as misalignment. I saw it as adaptation. And because this adaptation worked, at least on the outside, it started to feel, well, normal. And that's the quiet part that I wanted to name here in this episode. Because when something feels normal for long enough, we stop questioning it. We stop noticing the effort it requires. And often we stop asking whether the identity that we're living from is even true for us or whether it's just become familiar. And I genuinely believed for a very long time that this was just who I am. It wasn't until quite a bit later, actually, that I realized how exhausting that belief had been, how the stories I had been telling about myself and my life had shaped my experience. Not because I was doing something wrong, but because ignoring yourself, your nature, your rhythms, your truth, your authentic self, it takes an enormous fucking amount of energy. Who knew, right? And this is where this also connects to relationships. When we live from an identity and stories that are built around adaptation, belonging over truth, safety over honesty, approval over alignment, we don't just do that at work. We do it in love. We do it in partnership. It shows up in how much we tolerate, how much we explain away, how much we ask of ourselves before ever asking anything of anyone else or of the relationship. So if anything stirred in you while you were listening, I just want to let you know here that you don't need to figure it out. You don't need to label it. In fact, you don't need to do anything with it. And I invite you to just notice. Perhaps ask yourself quietly, who did I learn to be in order to belong? And what would soften if I didn't have to work so damn hard at being that? Sometimes coming home to yourself isn't a big leap. It's a subtle remembering. And if that remembering is happening right now, that's not a problem. That's simply an invitation. Thanks for listening. If this rant landed, hit follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And check out my additional resources at coachchristyholt.com. If you're craving clarity in your own relationship, reach out. I'd love to connect. I love you. Now let's go do some epic shit, shall we?